Picture this. You are 5 years old and your world is about to end in the most unimaginable way possible. The morning sun filters through the wooden shutters of your family's modest home in the mountains of Georgia, casting dancing shadows across the dirt floor where you play with a handful of carved wooden animals your father made for you. Your mother hums a lullaby while grinding grain, the same melody she sung to you every morning since you could remember. The scent of bread baking fills the air, mixing with the mountain wildflowers your sister picked yesterday. You have no idea that this is the last morning you will ever wake up as a free child. You don't know that men are already riding toward your village, their saddlebags heavy with silver coins and their hearts empty of mercy. You can't comprehend that before the sun sets today. You will be torn from everything you've ever known and thrust into a nightmare that will define the rest of your short life. The sound that changes everything begins as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the peaks. But it's not thunder. It's the sound of horses, dozens of them, carrying riders whose very presence means death or worse for the children of your village. Your mother stops humming. Your father drops the tool he was mending. Even at 5 years old, you understand that something terrible is about to happen. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. This isn't just another tale of historical cruelty. This is the story of how an entire system was built on the systematic destruction of childhood innocence, where 5-year-old girls were harvested like crops to feed the appetites of an empire that measured its wealth not in gold or territory, but in the broken spirits of the children it consumed. The Ottoman Empire's hunger for young slaves wasn't some dark secret whispered about in palace corridors. It was official policy, celebrated and systematized, with trade routes and supply chains as organized as any modern corporation. But unlike merchants dealing in silk or spices, these traders dealt in human souls. And their most prized merchandise was always the youngest, the most beautiful, and the most vulnerable. Your village nestled high in the Georgian mountains had survived countless raids over the centuries. The people here were hardy, suspicious of strangers, quick to hide their children when unknown riders approached. But this morning, the raiders came from 3 directions at once, cutting off every escape route with the precision of a military operation. Because that's exactly what it was. The Crimean Tatars who thundered into your village weren't random bandits seeking quick plunder. They were professional slave hunters, working under contract for Ottoman buyers who had placed specific orders. The demand was always highest for children between the ages of 4 and 8, particularly girls with light skin and unusual eye colors. You, with your pale Georgian complexion and startling green eyes, were exactly what they had come to find. When the riders burst through your door, their faces were covered with cloth, but their eyes held a coldness that made your blood freeze. They weren't angry or violent in the way you might expect from raiders. They were businesslike, efficient, treating you and your family like items in a warehouse inventory. One man grabbed you while another held back your screaming parents. A third made notes in a leather-bound ledger, recording your approximate age, physical condition, and estimated market value. Your mother's screams still echo in your memory decades later, but at 5 years old, you couldn't understand why she was fighting so desperately to reach you. You thought this was some kind of game, that these men were taking you on an adventure and you'd be home by dinner. The last thing you saw of your family was your father's face pressed against the window as the raiders carried you away, his expression a mixture of rage and helplessness that would haunt your dreams for years to come. The journey to the slave markets began immediately, and it was designed to break your spirit before you ever reached your destination. You were chained to a dozen other children, most of them girls around your age, all torn from their families that same morning. The oldest was maybe 10, the youngest couldn't have been more than 4. None of you understood what was happening, but the terror was infectious, spreading from child to child like a plague. The raiders provided just enough food and water to keep their merchandise alive, but not enough to maintain strength or hope. Children who cried too much were gagged. Those who tried to escape were beaten in front of the others as a lesson. You learned quickly that survival meant silence, compliance, and the complete suppression of every natural childhood instinct you possessed. During rest stops, the traders would examine their captives like livestock, checking for signs of illness, injury, or defiance that might affect their selling price. They paid particular attention to you, discussing your unusual eye color and unblemished skin in terms that made you feel like a prized animal being prepared for auction. One trader lifted your chin, turned your head from side to side, and nodded approvingly before making another note in his ledger. The other children became your only source of comfort during those endless days of travel. A girl named Miriam, perhaps a year older than you, had been taken from a village just south of yours. She spoke the same language and understood the same songs your mother used to sing. At night, when the raiders thought you were sleeping, she would whisper stories about brave princesses who escaped from dragons and found their way home. You clung to these fantasies because the alternative was accepting a reality too horrible for a 5-year-old mind to process. But Miriam's stories couldn't protect you from the harsh mathematics of the slave trade. Every day of travel increased your distance from home and decreased your chances of ever seeing your family again. The traders knew this, and they used geography as a weapon against hope. They would point to distant mountains and tell you in broken Georgian that your village was now many days behind you, too far for anyone to follow, too far for you to ever find your way back. The transformation from free child to human merchandise happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. First, your clothes were replaced with a simple tunic that marked you as property. Then your hair was cut and styled in a way that would appeal to buyers. Your name was forgotten, replaced by a number that corresponded to your entry in the trader's ledger. By the time you reached the markets of Kaffa on the Black Sea coast, you had already begun to disappear as an individual person. Kaffa was a revelation of horror that no child should ever witness. The port city served as the central hub for the Ottoman slave trade, processing thousands of human beings every month with the efficiency of a modern factory. The market specialized in different types of merchandise: strong men for galley ships, skilled craftsmen for urban workshops, beautiful women for wealthy households, and children like you for purposes that the traders discussed only in whispers. Your first glimpse of the slave pens was like staring into hell itself. Hundreds of children, some as young as 3, were crowded into wooden enclosures barely large enough to hold them. Many showed signs of the brutal journey that had brought them here: scarred faces, missing fingers, eyes that had already died despite their young bodies still breathing. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting food, and the peculiar odor of despair that seemed to cling to everyone in that place. The process of preparing you for sale was methodical and dehumanizing. First came the medical examination, conducted by traders who had learned to assess children with the expertise of veterinarians. They checked your teeth, examined your skin for blemishes, tested your reflexes, and evaluated your potential for various types of service. Every aspect of your 5-year-old body was cataloged and assigned a value. Next came the grooming phase, designed to maximize your appeal to potential buyers. Your hair was washed and arranged in elaborate styles that emphasized your youth and innocence. Your skin was scrubbed until it glowed, then treated with oils that made you shine under the market's torchlight. You were dressed in clothing specifically designed to showcase your most marketable features while maintaining the pretense of modesty that some buyers preferred. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more cruel than the physical transformation. Older slaves, broken by years of servitude, were assigned to teach new arrivals the basics of submission. You learned to walk with downcast eyes, to respond instantly to commands in multiple languages, and to display the kind of helpless vulnerability that certain buyers found irresistible. These lessons were reinforced through a system of rewards and punishments that trained you to associate compliance with survival. Throughout this process, you clung to the hope that someone would rescue you. Perhaps your father would appear with other men from your village, fighting their way through the markets to carry you home. Maybe your mother would somehow track you across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. These fantasies sustained you during the darkest moments, but they also made the reality of your situation even more crushing when rescue never came. The auction itself was theater designed to extract maximum profit from human misery. You stood on a raised platform while buyers examined you like a piece of jewelry they were considering for purchase. They discussed your potential in terms that reduced you to a collection of desirable characteristics: your age, your appearance, your apparent intelligence, and your suitability for various forms of service that you didn't yet understand. The bidding was conducted in multiple languages, with translators ensuring that every potential buyer could participate. The prices climbed steadily as merchants, ship captains, and wealthy households competed for the privilege of owning you. You watched the faces in the crowd, trying to guess which one would become your new master, wondering if any of them showed signs of the kindness your child's heart still believed might exist in the world. When the hammer finally fell, ending the auction that had determined your fate, you were sold to a man whose appearance would be burned into your memory forever. He was tall and well-dressed, with the soft hands of someone who had never performed manual labor. His eyes held a calculating intelligence that seemed to catalog your every feature for future reference. Most disturbing of all was his smile, which never reached his eyes and suggested pleasures that your innocent mind couldn't begin to comprehend. This man, you would later learn, was an agent for one of the Ottoman Empire's most powerful officials, a man whose appetite for young slaves was legendary throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Your new owner had traveled hundreds of miles specifically to acquire children like you, and he had paid a premium price that reflected both your rarity and your intended purpose. The journey to Constantinople began immediately, and it marked the final stage of your transformation from Georgian mountain child to Ottoman slave. The ship that carried you across the Black Sea was filled with human cargo, hundreds of people who had been purchased at markets throughout the region. But you were part of a special group, kept separate from the others and given slightly better treatment that reflected your higher value and more specific destination. During the voyage, you began to understand that your suffering had only just begun. The other children whispered stories about the palace where you were headed, describing a world of unimaginable luxury built on foundations of systematic cruelty. They spoke of golden halls where children like you were transformed into living dolls, trained to please masters whose desires knew no bounds of decency or restraint. As the ship approached Constantinople and you caught your first glimpse of the city that would become your prison, you made a promise to yourself that no 5-year-old should ever have to make. You vowed to survive whatever awaited you, to remember your real name and your mountain village, and to never completely surrender the small spark of defiance that still flickered in your heart despite everything you had endured. You didn't know then that this promise would be tested in ways that would challenge the very foundations of human endurance, or that the palace ahead held horrors that would make your journey to this point seem like a gentle introduction to suffering. All you knew was that somewhere in those distant mountains your parents were still alive, still hoping for your return, and that hope was the only weapon you had left in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything that made you human. The great city loomed before you, its minarets and domes promising wonders beyond imagination, but you were no longer a child who believed in wonders. You were merchandise, arriving at your final destination, about to discover what it truly meant to be owned by an empire that had perfected the art of breaking human spirits while keeping their bodies intact for pleasure and service. The moment you set foot on Constantinople's marble quays, the scope of your new reality began to crystallize with terrifying clarity. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of stone and shadow that dwarfed anything your mountain-raised eyes had ever imagined. The sounds hit you first. Thousands of voices speaking in languages that twisted your tongue, just trying to form the unfamiliar syllables. The clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones. The calls of merchants hawking wares you couldn't identify. Then came the smells, a complex tapestry of spices, perfumes, sweat, and something else you would later recognize as the particular odor of absolute power. Your handler, the well-dressed man who had purchased you, moved through the crowds with practiced ease, his hand gripping your shoulder with just enough pressure to remind you that escape was impossible. Around you, other newly arrived slaves stumbled forward in various states of shock and despair. Some wept openly, others stared with the blank expressions of minds that had simply shut down rather than process their circumstances. You tried to memorize every detail of the journey through the city, Some part of your 5-year-old brain still believing this information might someday help you find your way home. The palace complex, when it finally came into view, defied every expectation your limited experience could have formed. The walls stretched higher than the mountains of your homeland, decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the afternoon sunlight. Guards in elaborate uniforms stood at intervals along the ramparts, their presence suggesting that whatever lay beyond those walls was precious enough to require constant protection. As you passed through the first gate, you entered a world that operated according to rules you didn't yet understand, but would soon learn to navigate or die. The courtyards were filled with people moving with purposeful efficiency, servants carrying silver trays, officials in silk robes discussing matters in hushed tones, and everywhere, always, the underlying current of absolute hierarchy that determined who lived, who suffered, and who simply disappeared. Your handler led you through a series of increasingly ornate chambers, each one more overwhelming than the last. The ceilings soared overhead, painted with scenes of celestial beauty that mocked the earthly horrors being perpetrated beneath them. The floors were covered with carpets so fine that your bare feet seemed to sink into clouds of silk and gold thread. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls, decorated with precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. But it was the silence that proved most unnerving. Despite the obvious wealth and activity surrounding you, everything moved with a muffled quality that suggested secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Servants communicated through gestures and meaningful glances. Even your footsteps seemed to be absorbed by the thick carpets and heavy tapestries that lined every surface. The moment of your formal presentation arrived without warning or ceremony. One moment you were walking through yet another marble corridor, the next you were pushed into a chamber where a figure sat behind an ornate desk, studying papers with the concentration of someone making life and death decisions. When he looked up, you saw eyes that held intelligence, cruelty, and something else that made your stomach clench with instinctive terror. This was Pasha Mehmet Rashid, though you wouldn't learn his name for weeks to come. He was a man who had risen to power through a combination of political cunning, strategic brutality, and an appetite for pleasures that pushed the boundaries of what even Ottoman society would tolerate. His collection of young slaves was legendary among those who knew to speak of such things only in whispers, and you had just become his newest acquisition. The examination that followed was conducted with clinical detachment that somehow made it more horrifying than outright violence would have been. Rashid circled you slowly, occasionally reaching out to turn your head or lift your chin, evaluating his purchase with the expertise of someone who had made such assessments countless times before. He spoke to your handler in rapid Turkish, discussing your qualities and potential as if you were a piece of furniture being considered for a specific room. What you couldn't understand then was that this evaluation was determining not just your immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of your brief life. Rashid was deciding which of his various establishments would best utilize your particular combination of youth, beauty, and apparent intelligence. Some children were sent to his urban properties, where they would serve in relatively public roles that required them to maintain some pretense of normal human interaction. Others disappeared into more private locations where their existence became known only to a select few who shared their master's particular tastes. Your unusual eyes proved to be your salvation and your curse. Rashid was particularly drawn to their striking green color, so rare among the Georgian children who typically passed through the slave markets. This distinction meant you would be kept in his personal household, rather than being sold to lesser officials or provincial governors. It also meant your suffering would be more refined, more psychologically sophisticated, and infinitely more damaging to whatever remained of your developing sense of self. The quarters you were assigned reflected your elevated status within the horrific hierarchy of the palace. Instead of the cramped cells where ordinary slaves were housed, you were given a small but beautifully appointed room in a section of the complex reserved for Rashid's most prized possessions. The walls were decorated with miniature paintings depicting scenes of pastoral beauty that seemed designed to mock your lost homeland. A small window looked out onto a garden where peacocks wandered among flowering trees, creating an illusion of paradise that made your actual circumstances even more surreal. Your education began immediately, conducted by a woman whose own story of degradation and survival was written in the careful way she moved through the world. Sultana Aisha had once been like you, a child torn from her family and thrust into this gilded nightmare. But that had been 20 years ago, and time had transformed her from victim into accomplice, someone who had learned that the only way to survive was to become indispensable to the system that had destroyed her. She taught you the basics of palace etiquette with the patience of someone who understood that your life depended on mastering these lessons. How to walk with the gliding motion that suggested grace rather than haste. How to position your hands when sitting or standing to convey the proper mixture of submission and availability. How to arrange your facial expression to appear serene and compliant while hiding whatever thoughts or emotions might displease your observers. The language lessons were perhaps the most crucial element of your transformation. Turkish, Arabic, and Persian were drilled into your young mind through repetition and reinforcement that bordered on torture. You learned that speaking your native Georgian was forbidden, punishable by beatings that would leave no visible marks but would teach you to associate your childhood tongue with pain. Within months, you began thinking in Turkish, your original language retreating to a hidden corner of your consciousness where it waited like a secret treasure you dared not examine too closely. More disturbing were the lessons in what Aisha euphemistically called deportment. These involved learning to anticipate and respond to various forms of attention from the palace's male inhabitants. You were taught to recognize the subtle signs that indicated someone's interest in you, and more importantly, how to respond in ways that would enhance rather than diminish your value. The specifics of these lessons were communicated through demonstration and implication rather than explicit instruction, creating a fog of confusion that prevented you from fully understanding what you were being prepared for. The psychological conditioning was woven into every aspect of your daily routine. You woke at dawn to the sound of bells that regulated palace life with military precision. Your days were structured around lessons, grooming sessions, and periods of display where you and other young slaves would be presented to visitors for their consideration. These presentations were disguised as cultural exhibitions or entertainment, but you gradually learned to recognize the calculating gazes of potential buyers or borrowers who were evaluating your suitability for their own purposes. Throughout this process, you clung to memories of your family with desperate intensity. At night, when the palace fell into its restless version of sleep, you would whisper your parents' names and try to recall the exact sound of your mother's lullabies. These mental exercises became a form of resistance, a way of maintaining some connection to the person you had been before your world ended. But even these precious memories began to fade as Turkish words replaced Georgian ones in your internal vocabulary, and palace routines overwrote the simple rhythms of mountain life. The other children in your situation became your only source of companionship and understanding. There was Layla, taken from a Kurdish village when she was 6, and now approaching her second year in the palace. Her eyes held a knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess, and she spoke in whispers about things that happened after dark in certain chambers of the complex. There was also Dmitri, a Greek boy whose beauty had caught Rashid's attention during a raid on Crete. He moved through the palace like a ghost, performing his duties with mechanical precision, while something essential inside him seemed to have died completely. These friendships were both lifeline and liability. The palace authorities understood that bonds between slaves could provide comfort that might interfere with the complete psychological breakdown they sought to achieve. Punishments were therefore designed to turn victims against each other, creating an atmosphere of mistrust that prevented genuine solidarity from developing. Children who were caught sharing food, comforting each other during punishments, or speaking too intimately were separated and subjected to different forms of correction that taught them to associate human connection with danger. Your first encounter with Rashid's personal attention came without warning, on a Thursday evening in late autumn. You had been in the palace for nearly 4 months, long enough to develop a routine that provided some illusion of stability in your chaotic new existence. Aisha had been preparing you for sleep when a eunuch guard arrived with instructions that you were to be brought immediately to the master's private quarters. The walk through the palace corridors seemed to last forever, each step carrying you deeper into a part of the complex you had never seen before. The decorations here were even more elaborate than in the public areas, but there was something oppressive about their beauty, as if all this luxury existed specifically to mask the horrors it contained. The air itself seemed thick with secrets and the lingering traces of fear that previous visitors had left behind. Rashid's chamber was a study in contrast that perfectly reflected the man himself. Priceless artworks hung beside instruments whose purpose you didn't recognize but which filled you with instinctive dread. Books in multiple languages shared shelf space with bottles containing substances that glowed with unnatural colors. The scent of rare incense couldn't quite mask underlying odors that suggested activities too disturbing for your young mind to process fully. When Rashid looked up from his reading, his smile held the predatory satisfaction of someone who had been anticipating this moment for months. He had allowed you time to adjust to palace life, to lose the rough edges of your mountain upbringing, and to develop the refined mannerisms that would make you a more satisfying acquisition. Now you were ready for the next phase of your education, the lessons that would teach you exactly why you had been purchased and what your future held. The conversation that followed was conducted in the gentle, almost fatherly tone that Rashid used when he wanted to seem benevolent rather than terrifying. He spoke about your progress, praising your quick mastery of palace customs and your obvious intelligence. He mentioned your unusual beauty and suggested that you were destined for great things within his household. But beneath these pleasant words was an undercurrent of ownership that made clear you were not a student being praised for good work, but property being evaluated for its continued usefulness. As the evening progressed, you began to understand that this was not a single conversation, but the beginning of a new phase in your captivity. Rashid's attention was not a reward for good behavior, but a form of attention that would reshape your existence in ways you couldn't yet comprehend. The man who had purchased you was finally ready to begin collecting on his investment, and you were about to learn what it truly meant to be owned by someone whose power was limited only by his imagination and his appetite for the forbidden. What followed that first evening in Rashid's private chambers was a systematic destruction of everything that remained of your childhood innocence, conducted with the methodical precision of someone who had perfected these techniques over decades of practice. The process began not with violence, but with something far more insidious. The gradual erosion of your understanding of what was normal, what was acceptable, and what you had any right to refuse. Rashid's approach was masterfully calculated to exploit the natural trust that children place in adult authority figures. He presented himself as a benevolent guardian who was providing you with opportunities that other children could only dream of. You were special, he explained, chosen for greatness within his household. The elaborate gifts he bestowed upon you, jewelry crafted by the empire's finest artisans, clothing made from silks that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime, access to books and tutors that represented the pinnacle of Ottoman education, all served to reinforce the narrative that you were privileged rather than victimized. The psychological manipulation was woven into every interaction with such subtlety that you began to question your own instincts when they warned you that something was fundamentally wrong. When Rashid's touches lingered longer than seemed appropriate, he would explain that this was how important men showed affection to their most treasured possessions. When his conversations turned to topics that made you uncomfortable, he would frame these discussions as essential education that you needed to become a sophisticated member of palace society. Your daily routine was restructured to increase your isolation from other children and your dependence on Rashid's approval. Special lessons were arranged for you alone, conducted in private chambers where no witnesses could observe what was actually being taught. These sessions, disguised as advanced instruction in literature, music, and philosophy, gradually introduced concepts and expectations that reshaped your understanding of your role within the palace hierarchy. The other children began to look at you differently as your elevated status became apparent. Some showed envy for the obvious preferential treatment you received, while others displayed a mixture of pity and fear that suggested they understood implications you were still too young to grasp fully. This social isolation was not accidental. It served to eliminate potential sources of support or alternative perspectives that might interfere with your psychological conditioning. Aisha's role in your life changed dramatically during this period, transforming from teacher to accomplice in ways that revealed the true horror of the system that had consumed you both. The woman who had once seemed like a protective figure now served as an intermediary between you and Rashid, preparing you for encounters whose nature became increasingly difficult to misinterpret. Her explanations for these preparations, the special baths with particular oils, the selection of specific garments, the application of cosmetics that emphasized your youth rather than concealing it, were delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used when teaching you palace etiquette. The realization of what was actually happening to you came not in a single moment of clarity, but through a gradual accumulation of experiences that your mind initially refused to process. The way certain servants would avert their eyes when they saw you returning from Rashid's chambers. The meaningful glances exchanged between palace officials when you appeared at formal gatherings. The careful way that conversations would shift when you entered a room, as if your presence reminded everyone of truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. Your body began to show signs of the stress that your conscious mind was still struggling to accept. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by nightmares that mixed memories of your lost family with visions of threats you couldn't yet name. Your appetite disappeared, leading to weight loss that Rashid found concerning enough to summon palace physicians for consultation. These medical examinations, conducted with clinical detachment that somehow made them more violating than outright cruelty, revealed the physical toll that psychological trauma was taking on your developing frame. The palace physicians, men who had learned to ask no questions about the conditions that created their patients' symptoms, prescribed various treatments designed to restore your health without addressing its underlying causes. Tonics to improve your appetite, powders to help you sleep, and oils to restore the luminous quality to your skin that had dimmed since your arrival in Constantinople. These remedies treated the surface manifestations of your suffering while ensuring that you remained attractive and functional for your intended purposes. As winter gave way to spring in your second year of captivity, the frequency and intensity of your private sessions with Rashid increased dramatically. What had begun as occasional evening conversations evolved into regular appointments that consumed increasing portions of your daily schedule. The pretense of education gradually gave way to more explicit acknowledgments of your true function within his household, though these acknowledgments were still couched in language that maintained plausible deniability for everyone involved. The transformation in your behavior during this period was noted by everyone who interacted with you, though none dared to comment directly on what they observed. The bright curiosity that had characterized your early months in the palace faded, replaced by a careful watchfulness that suggested you had learned to anticipate danger in every situation. Your speech became more measured, filtered through an awareness that any word could be interpreted as defiance or ingratitude worthy of correction. Most disturbing was the way you began to internalize the narratives that Rashid constructed around your experiences. His insistence that you were special, chosen, and privileged gradually became part of your own self-understanding, creating a psychological framework that made resistance seem not just futile, but ungrateful. The gifts, the attention, the obvious investment in your welfare, all of these elements combined to create a form of Stockholm Syndrome that bound you to your captor more effectively than any physical restraint. The presence of other children in similar circumstances should have provided some form of solidarity or shared understanding, but the palace authorities had learned to prevent such connections from developing. Competition was fostered between Rashid's various young favorites, with privileges and punishments distributed in ways that encouraged rivalry rather than cooperation. You learned to see other children not as fellow victims, but as threats to your own precarious position within the household hierarchy. This isolation was reinforced by the gradual revelation of what happened to children who fell from favor or who aged beyond their usefulness to men like Rashid. Some were sold to lesser officials or provincial governors, their fates unknown but presumably grim given the circumstances of their disposal. Others simply disappeared from the palace entirely, their absence explained through vague references to reassignment or return to their families that no one believed but no one dared to question. The specter of these disappeared children haunted your daily existence, serving as a constant reminder that your current circumstances, however horrible, represented a form of protection that could be withdrawn at any moment. This knowledge created a desperate need to please, to remain useful, to avoid any behavior that might result in your own mysterious disappearance from the palace rolls. Your education during this period took on increasingly disturbing dimensions as Rashid began to share you with select members of his social circle. These encounters, presented as opportunities for you to demonstrate your accomplishments to important visitors, gradually revealed the true nature of the network that sustained the palace's appetite for young slaves. Wealthy merchants, high-ranking military officers, and influential court officials all participated in a system that treated children like luxury goods to be sampled and evaluated. The conversations you overheard during these gatherings provided glimpses into the broader machinery of exploitation that had brought you to this place. References to supply routes from various regions, discussions of quality and pricing, complaints about the difficulty of obtaining merchandise with specific characteristics. All of this was discussed with the casual tone of men engaged in ordinary commercial transactions, rather than the systematic destruction of human lives. Your role in these gatherings evolved from passive display to more active participation, as your handlers determined that you had developed sufficient skills and psychological conditioning to be trusted with greater responsibilities. You learned to serve wine with precisely the right degree of deference, to engage in conversation that demonstrated your education while maintaining appropriate submission, and to respond to various forms of attention in ways that enhanced rather than diminished your perceived value. The psychological conditioning required to perform these roles effectively created a form of dissociation that allowed you to function while protecting some essential part of yourself from complete destruction. You learn to exist simultaneously as the person performing these actions and as an observer watching someone else perform them, creating a mental distance that made survival possible, but at the cost of your integrated sense of self. This dissociative ability became more pronounced as the demands placed upon you intensified throughout your second year in the palace. The child who had once played with wooden animals in a Georgian mountain village now moved through Ottoman high society with practiced ease, speaking multiple languages fluently, demonstrating cultural knowledge that impressed sophisticated adults, and maintaining the kind of refined behavior that suggested breeding rather than training. But beneath this polished exterior, something fundamental was dying. The memories of your family, once vivid enough to sustain hope of eventual reunion, began to fade like paintings exposed to too much sunlight. Your native language, once the soundtrack of your internal thoughts, was gradually replaced by Turkish and Arabic phrases that felt foreign even as they became automatic. Most tragically, your capacity for genuine emotion was being systematically eroded by the constant need to perform feelings that served others' purposes, rather than expressing your own authentic responses to your circumstances. The palace authorities monitored these changes with the professional interest of craftsmen perfecting their techniques. Regular evaluations assessed your progress, not just in terms of skills acquired, but in terms of psychological transformation achieved. These assessments, conducted by specialists who had devoted their careers to the systematic breaking and rebuilding of human personalities, determined whether you were ready for the next phase of your development or required additional conditioning to achieve the desired level of compliance. As your 7th birthday approached, though you had long since stopped marking such personal milestones, the discussions about your future became more frequent and more explicit. You had reached an age where your value within the current system was approaching its peak, but you were also approaching the threshold where different forms of exploitation might become more profitable than your current role. These calculations were made with the cold efficiency of accountants managing a portfolio, weighing various options for maximizing return on investment while minimizing risk and maintenance costs. The awareness that your fate was being decided through such calculations created a new form of terror that went beyond physical fear. You began to understand that you existed not as a person with inherent worth, but as a commodity whose value fluctuated according to market conditions and consumer preferences. This realization completed the psychological transformation that had begun with your capture, reducing you to a collection of attributes and capabilities that could be evaluated, traded, and ultimately discarded when they no longer served their intended purposes. The final phase of your transformation arrived with the subtle inevitability of winter following autumn. By the time you turned 7, the last vestiges of the mountain child you had once been existed only as faint echoes in dreams that came less and less frequently, The palace had succeeded in its methodical reconstruction of your identity, creating something that appeared human, but functioned according to entirely different principles than those that governed normal childhood development. Your daily existence had become a carefully choreographed performance, where every gesture, every word, every expression served purposes that extended far beyond your own survival. The skills you had acquired, the languages that flowed from your tongue like native speech, the cultural knowledge that impressed visiting dignitaries, the refined mannerisms that suggested noble breeding, all of these accomplishments were tools in service of an economy that measured success by your ability to generate pleasure and profit for others. The realization of what you had become crystallized during a gathering in late spring, when you found yourself serving wine to a group of merchants discussing trade routes through your homeland. They spoke casually about the ongoing raids, the steady supply of new merchandise, the particular qualities that made Georgian children so valuable in Ottoman markets. As you moved silently between their chairs, refilling goblets and offering delicacies, you understood with devastating clarity that you were listening to men discuss the systematic destruction of childhoods identical to your own. One merchant mentioned a recent acquisition, a girl of perhaps 5 years with unusual green eyes, who had commanded an exceptional price at the Kaffa markets. The description matched your own so precisely that for a moment you wondered if they were somehow speaking about you, until you realized they were describing another child, another family torn apart, another small life about to be consumed by the same machinery that had devoured your own innocence. The conversation continued around you as if you were invisible, these men comfortable discussing their trade in human misery in front of someone they no longer recognized as fully human. Their casual references to supply and demand, to quality control and market preferences, painted a picture of systematic horror that extended far beyond your individual tragedy. You were not unique. You were simply one product among thousands, in an industry that had perfected the art of converting childhood into commodity. That night, alone in your beautifully appointed prison, you tried to remember your mother's face and found that the image had become blurred beyond recognition. The lullabies she had sung existed now only as melodies without words, the emotional content drained away by years of forced forgetting. Your father's voice had become a whisper you could barely distinguish from the wind through the palace corridors. Even your own name, your real name, had become foreign to your tongue, replaced so thoroughly by the identity imposed upon you that reclaiming it felt like trying to resurrect the dead. The palace physicians noted the changes in your behavior during this period with professional satisfaction. The resistance that had occasionally flickered in your early months of captivity had been extinguished completely, replaced by a compliance so perfect it seemed almost supernatural. You anticipated needs before they were expressed, responded to commands before they were fully articulated, and maintained the exact degree of availability and submission that maximized your value while minimizing any inconvenience to your handlers. This transformation represented the culmination of techniques refined over centuries of practice, methods that had been passed down through generations of men who had made careers of breaking human spirits while preserving the bodies that housed them. You had become their masterpiece, a child so thoroughly reconstructed that you no longer possessed the psychological framework necessary to conceive of resistance, escape, or even the basic human right to exist for your own purposes rather than others' pleasure. The other children who shared your circumstances had undergone similar metamorphoses, each shaped according to the specific demands of their intended roles within the palace hierarchy. Some had been molded into entertainers whose artificial enthusiasm masked the emptiness where genuine emotion had once resided. Others had become living ornaments, beautiful and silent, their presence serving to demonstrate their owner's wealth and refined tastes. A few had been trained as translators and cultural intermediaries, their childhood experiences of trauma transformed into professional qualifications for facilitating communication between predators and new victims. The bonds that had once existed between you and these other children had been systematically severed through techniques that turned potential allies into competitors and witnesses into accomplices. The palace authorities understood that solidarity could undermine the psychological isolation necessary for complete control. So they had created an environment where survival depended on individual compliance rather than collective resistance. Your final months in the palace passed with the surreal quality of a fever dream, where events occurred around you without your active participation. You moved through increasingly elaborate social gatherings, serving men whose conversations revealed the vast scope of the systems that had consumed you. You listened to discussions of political alliances built on the exchange of human gifts, trade agreements that included provisions for the regular supply of young slaves, and military campaigns whose primary objective was the acquisition of new populations to harvest for their children. The Ottoman Empire, you came to understand, had built its power not just on conquest and administration, but on the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable members of conquered populations. The palace where you now existed was merely one node in a vast network that processed thousands of children annually, transforming them from individuals with families and futures into commodities that served the empire's various appetites for beauty, service, and sexual gratification. Your own fate within this system was determined by the same market forces that governed any other trade good. As you approached your 8th birthday, discussions about your future became more frequent and more explicit. The value you had provided during your years in Rashid's household was being weighed against the costs of continued maintenance and the potential returns from alternative arrangements. These calculations were conducted with the dispassionate efficiency of accountants managing a business portfolio, evaluating options for maximizing profit while minimizing risk. The decision, when it came, arrived without ceremony or explanation. One morning you woke to find Aisha packing your few possessions into a small trunk. Her movements quick and nervous in a way that suggested she knew more about your destination than she was willing to reveal. The explanation she provided was characteristically vague. You were being transferred to serve in another household, a great honor that reflected your exceptional training and behavior. But the fear in her eyes told a different story, one that you had learned to read in the expressions of palace inhabitants who had witnessed too many such transfers to believe the official explanations. You were being disposed of, passed along to someone whose requirements or preferences differed from Rashid's current needs. Whether this represented an improvement or a deterioration in your circumstances was impossible to determine, but the secretive nature of the arrangement suggested that your new destination was not one that could be discussed openly, even within the palace's already secretive environment. The journey to your final destination took place at night, through streets you had never seen before, to a part of Constantinople that existed in the shadows beyond the official maps of the imperial capital. The building where you were delivered looked unremarkable from the outside, a prosperous merchant's house, indistinguishable from dozens of others in the district. But the man who received you carried himself with the particular combination of wealth and cruelty that you had learned to recognize in those who specialized in the most forbidden forms of exploitation. Your new owner examined you with the expertise of someone who had made countless such acquisitions, his evaluation thorough and utterly impersonal. He discussed your qualities and training with the agent who had delivered you, negotiating final details of the transaction in terms that left no doubt about your status as purchased property. The price mentioned was substantial enough to suggest that your years of conditioning had created significant value, but also that your intended use would justify the investment through returns that you preferred not to contemplate. The house itself was a maze of rooms designed to serve purposes that became clear only gradually, as you were introduced to its rhythms and expectations. Other children moved through its corridors with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that survival depended on perfect performance of assigned roles. Their ages ranged from barely older than you to adolescents whose approaching maturity marked them for different forms of exploitation or disposal. The rules governing your new existence were explained with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that had characterized your education in palace etiquette, but these rules served different purposes than those you had learned before. Here, the emphasis was not on creating refined companions for sophisticated social gatherings, but on producing compliant participants in activities that could never be acknowledged publicly or recorded in official documents. Your training resumed immediately, focusing on skills and behaviors that completed the destruction of whatever remained of your original identity. The child who had once played in Georgian mountain meadows was finally and completely erased, replaced by something that existed solely to serve purposes that no child should ever be forced to understand, let alone fulfill. The last entry in your story was written not in words but in silence. The silence of a system that operated beyond the reach of law or conscience. The silence of victims whose suffering was too profitable to acknowledge. And the silence of a society that built its glory on foundations of carefully hidden horror. You disappeared into that silence, one more child consumed by an empire's appetite for the innocent. Your fate a testament to humanity's capacity for transforming love into ownership, childhood into commodity, and hope into the raw material of others' pleasure. In the end, your story became what it had always been destined to become. A cautionary tale whispered in shadows, a reminder that behind every empire's golden age lie the broken bodies and shattered souls of those who paid the price for others' prosperity. The mountain village where you were born never learned what became of their lost daughter, but somewhere in the bureaucratic records of the Ottoman Empire, your sale was recorded with the same careful attention to detail that marked all their other successful transactions in human flesh. The only monument to your existence was the profit you generated for those who owned you. And even that faded with time as new merchandise replaced old inventory in the endless cycle of supply and demand that kept the empire's darkest appetites satisfied. You had become what the system intended all along, a ghost haunting the margins of history, your suffering transformed into someone else's pleasure, your childhood sacrificed on the altar of absolute power's most terrible hungers.